Whoever is listening, guys, welcome back. My name is Grayson Mann, and welcome to our midpoint of our Clemson Football Podcast preview series. This is going to be part 5, along with part 6 coming later this week. Today, we have Jacey Zembal, writer for NC State Rivals. Jacey, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for doing this. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great.
So, Jacey, can you just, by starting off this podcast, walk us through what your role is with Rivals and currently what you're up to? Because what it sounds like, based off your Twitter feed, you're at some basketball clinic, I think.
No, basically, I just had a binge from July 2nd through July 9th of 3 days at the Nike Peach Jam, which had all the top Nike kids for basketball. And that was in North Augusta, South Carolina. And then 4 days at the Adidas event, which was in Rock Hill, South Carolina. And between the two events, I probably ripped through and seen, we'll say maybe 70% of the high major players between Nike and Adidas.
That's awesome. So for your role of NC State Rivals, can you walk the audience through what your day-to-day role is per se, or just kind of what you do on an average day?
I'm the unique person where I do both basketball and football, cover the teams for NC State, and then also cover football recruiting and basketball recruiting. And then every now and then I'll dabble with women's basketball or baseball just to, keep my hand in the mix of things. Or, every now and then State will have a superstar girls basketball recruit that people are interested in. This particular cycle, it's Sarah Strong, whose parents are both South Carolina prep legends in some ways. Danny Strong played at NC State, made the Shrine Bowl in football, Division I basketball player. Sarah's mom is probably one of the top 3 or 4 all-time players in the history of South Carolina high school basketball. Went to Harvard, maybe one the best or second best Ivy League basketball player ever, made the WNBA. And then Sarah's top 5 in the country in the class of 2024. So, between all of that, it keeps me very, very busy. And, some months are more hectic than others. June was a mix of basketball events and football camps and football commitments. And then July, the first start of the month, was all about basketball recruiting. And then there'll probably be 3 or 4 commitments this month. And then they have a big recruiting event July 28th called the Alpha Wolf, which will bring in a lot of football recruits to NC State. And then August will come around and it'll be all about team coverage of the football team. And then it gets a little crazier when November hits and both basketball and football are going at the same time, and high school football and high school basketball are going at the same time. So maybe May is a little bit of a quiet month, but usually there's always something to do.
Sounds just like it. So let's rewind back to 2022 and just get your impressions. We'll go kind of in a chronological sense from there. So NC State, there was a lot of attention on this team heading into 2022 as a team that could really legitimately compete for the ACC. They had taken down Clemson the year prior, and they had this anticipated matchup in Death Valley that ended up being College Game Day. And right after that, NC State loses Devin Leary for the season and finishes 8-5. To you, when you covered this team, what was the impression of NC State for 2022? And how did, in your opinion, they salvage a season where they lose their top player and he ends up transferring out?
You're right on the hype. Part of the hype was a few things. It was a perfect storm of having players back because of the COVID year. It was a perfect storm of having some guys not enter the NFL draft because they were injured and really couldn't work out for NFL teams. So they came back. So next year now they had like 17 returning starters or something. And my one hesitation on the hype from at this time last year is that they had the experience and they had productive players, but I didn't know how many NFL future players they had. And that ended up being proven true in the draft when some guys just didn't get drafted. And Chandler Zavala, guard, he was drafted. But some great players, but they ended up being undrafted free agents. And they might make the NFL, like Drake Thomas at linebacker, or say Christopher Dunn as a kicker. So, but in terms of just pure NFL talent, The NFL didn't view the Wolfpack the same way as maybe all ACC teams did. So the thing that was a little crazy though is that with all that returning talent and experience, they really struggled again in the opener against East Carolina, and could have easily lost that game if not for ECU missing a field goal. So that was kind of like the first alarm bells that went off, is that the offense struggled against ECU in the opener. And then, as you mentioned, Devin Leary eventually gets hurt, and they play 4 different quarterbacks. And 8-5 could have been a lot worse in retrospect. But MJ Morris was a true freshman who played lights out against Wake Forest, and that was a big win. And then Ben Finley, who started the year as the first string quarterback, helps NC State beat UNC. And in Wolfpack land, a win over UNC makes for a great year regardless. So, it's one of those deals where that 8-5 could easily have been 6-6, with a break here and there. But, the disappointment then kind of went full circle was how bad the offense was against Maryland in the bowl game. 16-12 loss to Maryland, who, both teams had some guys not play. Maryland had some guys, sit out for the NFL draft, and but the offense for NC State was just abysmal that day. Obviously, not getting a touchdown, and the Ben Finley that looked great against you. Well, I shouldn't say great. That's a strong word. But the Ben Finley who was effective against UNC was not anywhere near that version against Maryland. And then he ends up transferring after the spring. And obviously, as you mentioned earlier, Devin Leary goes to Kentucky. Part of that is probably today's world of NIL. The other part is, maybe both sides were ready for a change. So State's offensive coordinator, Tim Beck, gets hired as the head coach at Coastal Carolina. And that gave the opportunity for a revamp on offense, which was, like I said, badly needed. And they end up hiring Robert Dene. And he had been he's a long time offensive coordinator, but he had just been at Syracuse. And before that, he was with Virginia. And he was tied at the hip with Virginia's former coach, Bronco Mendenhall, for a long time between BYU and Virginia. And then they bring in Garrett Tujay as the offensive line coach from Virginia, who also had been with Dene for all those years at BYU and Virginia. So it's a different style. We're talking about more air raid. Now, I will say that I think one difference with Dene is that he'll coach to his talent. So if he has a good running game, he'll have a nice balanced offense. If it's more about the passing game, he'll air it out. But I don't think he's the stereotypical air raid guy who, no matter what's, going to want to throw the ball 50 plus times. So, he comes in. NC State needs a quarterback to at least balance out MJ Morris, and they end up bringing Brennan Armstrong in. And then that opens up a whole different can of worms because, obviously Armstrong had been with Dene at Virginia, and he was looking for a new home. And it made sense for him because, as Clemson fans know, the Tony Elliott offense, kind of sputtered at Virginia this past year. And it wasn't all because of the offense or Brennan Armstrong. I don't think people quite understood the situation at Virginia. But so to give context, Brennan Armstrong in 2021 had a terrific statistical season. Threw for over 4,000 yards. He runs well. Good touchdown to interception ratio. A legit preseason all ACC candidate based on his previous year numbers. And, record wise, I think they went 6-6. And maybe their best win was against Miami. So it didn't exactly pay off with huge victories or anything in 2021. But, 6-6 with Virginia has kind of been what they've been doing. They usually win between 6 and 8 games. And Bronco Mendenhall then retires. Next thing you know, the entire offensive line either goes pro or enters the portal. A good tight end was going to be in the draft. He goes, I think, 3rd or 4th round. They didn't really have much of a running game. One of the receivers then got hurt early last year, Billy Kemp. And next thing you know, basically Brennan Armstrong was playing with a kind of a flex tight end who used to be a quarterback at Mississippi State, who's very good, and then a future NFL draft pick wide receiver, and that was it. The whole line was not good. The running back situation was not ideal, and obviously then they have a tragedy at the end of the year with their teammates getting shot and killed, a couple of them getting killed. So what could go wrong basically went wrong, and I know people want to blame Tony Elliott or Brendan Armstrong or former NC State offense coordinator, running backs coach Des Kitchens, who's the offense coordinator at Virginia. But that was just kind of like a perfect storm of how an offense could go downhill fast based on personnel and losses. And I watched them play Virginia play Illinois, which was probably like their second game of the season. And, the dynamic that was interesting there is, Brett Bielema is the head coach of Illinois. He had Dave Doran of NC State as his defense coordinator at Wisconsin. The secondary coach, Aaron Henry, played for Doran and Bielema at Wisconsin, coached under Doran at NC State, now at Illinois, just got bumped up to defensive coordinator. The NFL draft had at least three defensive backs from Illinois get drafted high. So very good defense, and they made Brendan Armstrong look bad. And one of the tackles who has since transferred to Boston College, who's probably playing his first real extensive action that, as a young left tackle, he really struggled, in pass blocking. And I was watching Brendan Armstrong, make poor passes and poor decisions. And there was no rhythm, there was no flow to their offense. So you could see how things had deteriorated. And based on his stats, it didn't really get much better from that point on. So now we have this dynamic where he's at NC State and he's reunited with Robert Dene, and he has the offensive line coach that he's familiar with, Garrett Tujay. And, they basically gave him the keys to the offense from day one. So MJ Morris, who probably for about a month thought he would be the guy, ended up being second string quarterback. And in a perfect world, it'd be great if MJ Morris could redshirt, play 4 games or less and get that redshirt year. But we'll see what happens. At the moment, they only have 3 scholarship quarterbacks, and one of them is a true freshman, Lex Thomas. So I think it's going to be very hard to get MJ Morris a redshirt year, but we'll see. And they tried to get a quarterback as in about a month ago, but he ended up rejoining Charlotte, where he had been in the past. So, could they still add a quarterback this summer? Well, clock's ticking, so I don't know. But so that's basically the quarterback spot. So people will be like, okay, the lazy thought or narrative has been he's back with his offensive coordinator. Brennan Armstrong is going to put up 2021 numbers again. Everything's going to be great. And I look at it as well, State doesn't have the wide receivers, tight ends that Virginia had in 2021. And State should have better running backs than Virginia did in 2021. And we'll see how the offensive line compares between the two. But yeah, I just don't think it's like that simple where Brennan Armstrong all of a sudden becomes a 4,000-yard thrower again. So, the gist is that he needs to find weapons on offense to throw to. And I'm not against the youth movement, which may not pay off this year, but pay off down the road. But they have a true freshman named Kevin Concepcion who played at Charlotte Chambers, and he's a gamer, more slot receiver who could also do some things on the outside. They have I guess you would call him a flex tight end named Javante Vereen, who's basically a wide receiver and plays tight end. Listed around 6'4", 210. But basically his wide receiver size and catches like a receiver, and may not have the 40-yard dash of an NFL wide receiver, but is obviously very fast enough to get by linebackers or safeties as a quote unquote flex tight end. And he's a true freshman from Havelock. They have a sophomore named Terrell Timmons, who is proven to be a deep ball guy. And then they have a handful of other guys who have played a lot and could do some things, but it's unknown. Keon Lassane is the oldest of the receivers. He's from the Charlotte area, went to Matthews Butler. Porter Rooks, whose older brother Patrick played basketball at Clemson for a bit. Porter arrived with a lot of fanfare. He was a four-star prospect by Rivals.com, but he has not completely gotten untracked in his NC State career. And then and he went to Martyrs Park in Charlotte, played with Drake May and Moose and Muhammad son, Moose. I don't know if he's Moose the Third or Moose Jr. But and then Julian Gray is a very fast, shifty wide receiver from another Charlotte area kid from Hopewell High in Huntersville. And maybe this is the year that he can make some things happen. Tight end has a little depth with the Sebro twins, who could be effective, but it's just a lot of unknowns. So that's kind of like, who will emerge as Brennan Armstrong's targets is one big storyline. Running the football, I think they'll be fine. It'll be by committee. It took a little bit of a hit when Demi Sumo Carmbele ended up transferring to Kentucky, where he joined Devin Leary. He would have been one of the three running backs for sure, and maybe he had the most upside of the three. But now will probably be two returning running backs with Michael Allen, who's a sophomore, who came on strong at the end of last year, and then Jordan Houston, who's more of a veteran, good in blitz pickup, catches the ball well, just steady. And then because of Demi Sumo Carmbele's departure, true freshman, or it's at least it likely will be a true freshman, Hendrik Raphael from Naples, Florida. It'll be his time to really emerge. And then, offensive line wise, they've always been pretty good pass blocking. It's always interesting. Fans always like to be critical of offensive linemen. I think I've picked up on that with Clemson fans. And so, NC State fans are similar. And what I've kind of learned is usually it's hard to be both good at run blocking and pass blocking. So State's typically been very good at pass blocking. They don't give up too many sacks. But then people always wish that they were better at run blocking. And it just seems to be hard to be good at both. Maybe Georgia can be, or Ohio State or Alabama, but there's only a few schools that are probably good at both. And for State, it's leaned towards more pass blocking. And they have a handful of veterans back. Timothy McKay at right tackle, Anthony Belton, who started probably first 2/3 of the season before I wouldn't say he got benched, but he kind of became more of a rotational tackle at the end. But Belton will be at left tackle, McKay at right tackle. Dylan McMahon has had a lot of experience, but it's been at guard. Now he'll play center. And then the guards will be kind of newish. It could be Derek Eason, who has started in the past. Lyndon Cooper has done very well. He would be a first-time starter at left guard. Maybe not a lot of depth on the O-line. So it's one of those years where, if someone got hurt, if a couple of guys got hurt, it would really jumble things up. But they had a transfer from Oregon named Dawson Jaramillo, who has a glorious mullet that he's known for. But he is one of those rare guys who can play all the offensive line positions. Like he actually even played center in the spring game. So he's the ultimate Swiss Army knife in case there's injuries, because he can play any of the spots. And that's essentially what is going on offensively, where, it'd be nice if State could average 28 points a game. Like that'd be a great number. It's just, it'll be very fascinating to see if they could do it.
Yeah, and with all the stuff that you've listed out, when we look at the schedule for NC State, and the thing that points out to me, and we'll get to that in a second, is they have home games like Notre Dame. They'll play a rising Duke team on the road. They'll welcome home a Clemson team that they've been back and forth with. Is there a point on the schedule that you look at when looking towards the future and for the fall that you think, okay, you start looking at certain games, you start checking them off the box. This could be a team that they could play really well against. This is a team that'll prove XYZ. What is your impressions of the schedule for NC State, and where do you think is a reasonable expectation for this program?
Schedule-wise is kind of interesting because, for the first time that I can remember, they have 2 Friday night games in September. So that's a little bit of a twist on the schedule, but which is not great for me covering high school football. But or for the staff to be able to go out and cover high school football. First game of the season is against UConn on a Thursday. So there's another game where it's not the typical Saturday. So the flip side to all this is they usually play UNC at the end of the year, right after Thanksgiving on a Friday. Now that's going to be on a Saturday, but they'll have 3 games. Will either be on a Thursday night or a Friday night. But UConn, team they should beat, team they beat handily last year, team that I was shocked when they made a bowl game. I mean, I thought Jim Moore Jr. did legit one of the better jobs in college football to get that team into a bowl game, because he had lost his quarterback before he played State, or maybe in the first quarter against State, or no, I think it was before they played State. It was a Penn State transfer. He got hurt. They lost their running back for a little bit, so I was amazed at them to squeeze out bowl eligibility. Obviously, home against Notre Dame will be the test in the beginning. A good showing there will give hope to the fans. If it ends up being a lopsided defeat, then people will react accordingly. The one of the Friday games is the Brennan Armstrong Bowl, which is at Virginia, September 22nd. That's a must-win game. And then a tricky game with Louisville, which, I'm going to assume Coach Brom's going to have a good offense somehow, some way. And I know he's brought in a quarterback that he had at Purdue, who I believe was at California last year. So, it's not an easy schedule, and it's funny, like you going in, you're thinking like they're going to end up playing like Florida State or, different teams, and they don't play Florida State because there isn't a division anymore. But we knew that this year's schedule would be harder than last year's because, as you mentioned, you have Clemson and you added Notre Dame, and then you always have UNC. They're going to play Miami. Who knows what Miami's going to look like in November? Could be good, could be a mess. I mean, you just don't know. Even a trickier non-conference opponent like Marshall's been good. Like they're not going to be a patsy. And then I've been saying for the last year that Riley Leonard of Duke is probably one of the best quarterbacks nobody really talks about, and he's terrific. And what Duke did last year was just sort of amazing under Mike Elko's first year. So all of a sudden that game is a lot harder than anticipated. And it's interesting, like, because Drake May casts such a large shadow at UNC, I don't think people understand just how good Riley Leonard is. So, my feeling was that because of the schedule being harder, that going 8-5 with that schedule would probably be a solid year for NC State. I don't know if the fans would be thrilled with 8-5, but I think 8-5 against that schedule is better than going 8-5 with the schedule they had last year.
All right, and I think the this is a good segue to start talking about, and this has been a common theme throughout this podcast series, is defining expectations, because we've had episodes with Florida State Rider, we've talked with Duke, we talked with Wake Forest, and the expectations vary for programs. Like an 8-win season at Wake Forest may be a really high achievement as compared to Florida State. That's not necessarily where they're shooting for. So with Dave Doran in this program at NC State, how does this program continue to define success moving forward?
I mean, the goal that has eluded them is a second 10-win season. They've only had one 10-win where they've won more than 10 games. That was with Philip Rivers, a quarterback, many, many moons ago. So that has always been the goal, is to, like last year, it just seemed like it was inevitable that they could win 10 games. And then everything kind of fell apart with the quarterback situation, and they end up with 8. Other years they've come close. I don't think the expectations for this year is 10 wins because of all the uncertainty on offense. But that's always been the long range goal, and I mean, historically, when you look at NC State's at the last 30 years, they usually win between 6 and 9 games. And they're also one of the rare programs that have won, say 9 games with multiple coaches, Tom O'Brien and Dave Doran and Chuck Amato and, Dick Sheridan, rest in peace, this past week. I think even Michael Caine squeezed in a 9-win season somewhere along the way, but I'd have to, research that. But they're that rare program where they've won, say 9 games with a lot of different coaches. So it's proven that, whoever the coach is at NC State, there's a certain baseline, and it's usually between 6 and 9 games. The 2019 season was the disaster, where injuries hit and wide receivers went pro early and nothing really worked offensively, and the team really skidded off the cliff. But then it played a bunch of young guys who were starting to be older players last year and still even around this year because of the extra COVID year. And that's also obviously has benefited NC State a lot. I always say expectations. I think the pressure on a program defines a program. Clemson fans expect success. They won't handle a 7-win season. That's just reality. They won't, and they won't put up with that. And as you mentioned, a 7-win season at Wake Forest is different than a 7-win season at, say, Clemson or certain other programs. And state fans have pressure on the program, but not to that extreme. There's no going to be hot seat calls if a state football coach wins 7 games or state basketball coach wins 20 games and makes it to the first round of the NCAA tournament. That type of stuff. I've never, it's funny that state fans got blamed a lot when Herb Sendek left. And I always felt it was kind of unfair in many ways because they've been as patient as can be with Sidney Lowe as head coach. And then, they would have been just as patient with Mark Gottfried until things spun out. And they've been patient with Kevin Keats. And, on the football side, Dave Doran's now in his 11th year. And Tom O'Brien would have had a longer stint if it wasn't for, changes in administration. I'm sure he would have kept on going because, Tom O'Brien and Dave Doran have proven that they can win between 6 and 9 games. So, but ultimately the goal is to get to 10 wins and to be in the mix. When the playoffs, get expanded, all of a sudden, teams will have more hope, to make the playoffs. There's been some talk over the last few years about trying to be a playoff team, but, usually by the 5th, 6th game of the season, that talk kind of goes poof. But when you have 12 teams making the playoffs, and the ACC, it's funny, everybody talks about the ACC and the weaknesses and getting out of the league and whatnot. And there's going to be some 2nd and 3rd place teams in the ACC that would going to make the playoffs, who, if they were in the SEC, they'd probably be going 8-5 because, just the schedule difference. I mean, I think it's going to be fascinating to see what happens to Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC because, their schedules are going to be no joke.
Yeah.
Great entertainment, like the entertainment factor of Texas and Oklahoma playing the teams they'll play, their fan base will love. But those are not fan bases that want to go 8-5, which could easily happen when you play, all the tough teams in the SEC. You look at the ACC. Everybody knows that Florida State, Clemson, and Miami have the recruiting advantages. But after that, it's always been wide open, and teams pop up. If Wake Forest can pop up, anybody can pop up because, they don't have recruiting advantages or financial advantages, and they're not winning because of NIL. So, the fact that they can do what they've done is under both Jim Grobe and now Coach Clausen is impressive. And, State's been very steady. But Miami's been very up and down. Virginia Tech's on a down cycle. Florida State had some, rudderless years up until last year. Miami's been kind of a hot mess. And then UNC is kind of in the same boat as State where they win their 7-8 games, but never really broken through. So, that's kind of where expectations are. And maybe it always goes back to the ACC was a basketball league. But on the football side, I've always felt, fans are happy if State wins 8-9 games, makes it to a bowl game, beats UNC. That makes for a good year and good offseason. But in order to get to the 10-win plateau, it always comes down to recruiting. And State's been very steady with where they usually are in recruiting. I think the staff has done some things a little differently where the position coaches have really zeroed in on their position recruits. where in the past it was more like a regional or area recruiter. But what I've said for probably the last year, the class of 2024 will be defined by who they get at wide receiver. And that goes back to what we talked to earlier. They don't have the weapons at receiver. Could go with the youth movement, get some guys in 2024. Those guys have a chance to play right away as freshmen. And so it'll be another year of a youth movement. And then that offense with MJ Morris at quarterback can, really be something, say, by, 2026, when they're older. And then people will get excited about the 2026 Wolfpack with MJ Morris and a bunch of young receivers, who have proven themselves after, say, a year or two in the program. Defensively, I've never felt it's ever really going to fall off. Tony Gibson is a terrific defensive coordinator. They've been able to do a 3-3-5 scheme. The defensive linemen aren't going to put up big sack numbers. Defensive ends are typically over 280 pounds and kind of play the role of a defensive tackle. So it's not so much having that 250-pound speed guy off the edge, but they've had great linebackers. They should always have good linebacker play. Peyton Wilson is back for his 6th year of college, which we didn't see coming. But, if not for injuries, he'd be in the NFL. And if he stays healthy, he's an all-ACC caliber linebacker. Aiden White is an all-ACC corner. Interesting mix in the secondary. There'll be some unknowns at safety. But Shaheem Battle and Aiden White both return at corner. They have a junior college transfer that they think has potential to really be something at safety. Bishop Fitzgerald. They got an Old Dominion transfer named Robert Kennedy who will help out at nickel. They have some guys who basically have started because of injuries enough to be considered almost near returning veterans. Devin Boykin and Jakeem Harris between the nickel and the safety. So they have guys. Jalen Scott and Devin Betty have played a lot at linebacker due to Peyton Wilson being injured in the past and Isaiah Moore being injured. So I think everybody is back on the D line except for Corey Durden of note, or at least almost everybody, but Corey Durden. CJ Clark, who has had injuries, will be moved inside nose tackle. He was a very hyped up recruit. He has to stay healthy. The depth behind him is very young. Savion Jackson, who's had a pair of bad injuries in his career, is back at defensive end. Davin Van is probably one of the better defensive ends that people don't know about. I think he's an all-ACC caliber player, whether second team, third team, first. I don't know. We'll see about first team, but it wouldn't surprise me, though, if he made at least some sort of all-ACC. And then they have depth at the end. Travali Price has played a lot. Noah Potter comes in, who was Ohio State and Cincinnati transfer. Another defensive end. They have a Red Hibbler, who's a JUCO defensive end. So they got depth. They got numbers. They should have a very good defense. Maybe not as good as last year's defense, which was quietly outstanding. Last year's defense rarely allowed to play over 30 yards, which is very stunning in college football. But they simply did not give up big plays, whether run play, pass play. Like in my head, I can only think of a few. Virginia Tech did a couple deep balls, where it was kind of a jump ball play and guy came down with a catch. But there just wasn't very many long plays. One of the few defenses that stymied Drake May in the UNC offense. And then actually probably the team that did the best against them was Clemson. Clemson's offense with DJ Ungolay, between him throwing the ball and running the ball, particularly running the ball. They were very good offensively that night, and they were one of the better teams against State's defense, but most teams really struggled. They shut down Wake Forest's vaunted offense, which was also surprising. So between the Wake Forest game and the UNC game, the defense, like I said, they make tackles, they don't give up big plays, and they can get off the field on third down. So, they may not have the absolute star power of other defenses, but between Peyton Wilson at linebacker and Aiden White at corner, if they get a couple other guys to be all ACC caliber players. They should be able to be one of the top probably 5 defenses in the ACC. And then Chris Dunn, who I think I mentioned earlier, he only missed one kick, and so he's gonna be tough to replace. So they brought in a transfer from Western Kentucky, who had been a Lou Groza Award semifinalist in the past. And then they have a preferred walk-on, or maybe he can even get on scholarship this year, who knows. But Colin White is, I think they're confident in him too. So they have two options at kicker. Caden Noonkester was quite the revelation at punter. Their punter got hurt. Next thing you know, this walk-on comes in, gangly 6'5" kid. And he was terrific. He shanked like one punt against UNC. That's it. Like everything else was like booming punts. So he proved that he's going to be fine. Return game, they'll have to find a punt returner. Could be Kevin Concepcion. It could be Julian Gray. We'll see what happens there. Julian Gray had return kicks. Not, maybe not a return game that's going to bust out a 90-yarder. In punt return or kick return, but should be okay, should be adequate. So, special teams should be fine. Defense should be very good. And then the offense will just, it's just going to be fascinating to see, like, can they put points on the board and get to, say, 28 points or in the 30s against some of the good teams?
Yeah, it's a wait and see type of thing with the NC State team. But something that you mentioned is the word steady that comes to mind, especially when talking about this history that Clemson and NC State have had, especially for the last, I want to say 7 years. For me, it goes back to 2016, where that national championship team with Clemson barely escapes with a field goal in overtime. 2017, Kelly Bryant comes up to NC State. Him and Bradley Chubb have a thing over a towel. And then you get to 2018-19. It's Trevor Lawrence, ETN. Clemson rolled over pretty much everybody except LSU at that point. And then you get to 21, there's a new guy in town, DJ Uyunglele. That does not rise up to the expectations that Clemson fans had, and NC State gets one. And so this 2022 matchup becomes this really highly anticipated event at Clemson. It was unbelievable on campus that day to be able to experience just what that game day atmosphere was like. Just covering it on that day. But what has this made NC State a tough matchup against Clemson? Because it feels like that's one that people are now circling on the calendar like they used to circle Florida State. They go, oh, we got to watch out for NC State, especially when you go up to their place. It's a tough place to play. It's a tough environment, and it's always a tough out. Why has that been the case with NC State?
I think it's because Clemson is the litmus game. I think for years, everybody kind of looked up to Florida State when they were humming along. And, you had to get to a certain level to compete with Florida State. And then the ACC kind of caught up to them a little bit. And then they had another great run with Jameis Winston. There was been some years where, State would play Clemson and the game would be over in the first quarter. Or I felt like on the third possession of the game where it's like, oh, Clemson goes up 21-0. This one's a wrap. I've seen that. Especially in Death Valley, between Trevor Lawrence or Deshaun Watson. I think I always point out things changed with Clemson when they brought in Chad Morris. Taj Boyd, I think, picked his third school in his recruitment, which ended up being Clemson, and Sammy Watkins arrived. It's funny. I think people have written about the importance of CJ Spiller, but from my perspective, I think Sammy Watkins kind of made them cool, combined with DeAndre Hopkins and all the other guys that they've had. But for some reason, it just seemed like they became super cool when Sammy arrived. And, Taj Boyd took care of the quarterback spot because I don't know if it was the year before, but I was at Clemson where it was 14-13 and neither team could really get to the 50-yard line. It was bad offense. So, went from 14-13 to teams who could, to Clemson teams that could really score. And, I think the 1 year State was able to beat them because they played a perfect game. Sammy Watkins was injured, but I don't think it even would have mattered. They just had a perfect game. And then obviously the Kyle Bambard year, he misses the field goal. I believe that was also the game where Wayne Gallman got hurt. So, there was that dynamic where, Clemson was on the ropes and Deshaun Watson couldn't run the football as well that day. And I think State knew what kind of physicality you had to have to play Clemson. And then, there's always a little chippiness probably on the recruiting trail. I'm sure it hit peak chippiness over the Dexter Lawrence recruitment, where Clemson was able to beat out NC State to get Dexter from Wake Forest, which is outside of Raleigh. You always kind of know that Clemson's going to be a factor with about 5 kids in North Carolina each cycle. Most often. And then obviously those 5 kids are guys that NC State or UNC or other national powers want to. This year, not so much butting heads. A little bit with Alex Taylor at wide receiver. Start off a little bit with Jonathan Paylor at receiver, but nothing crazy like on the recruiting trail this year. Last year, Sullivan Absher, both State and Clemson wanted, and ends up picking Notre Dame. Tackle from Belmont South Point. But so some of it comes with recruiting. But you want to be the best, you got to be Clemson. And it's simple. And if I'm the coach at State, I'm thinking about trying, my entire offseason, I'm thinking about what can I do to beat Clemson? What ways can we catch up? It's just a natural thing. Sure, Big Ten teams feel the same way with Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State, and USC ruled the roost in the Pac-12, and Texas and Oklahoma are the perceived big boys when they were in the Big 12. So, you want to be the best, you got to be Clemson. So I think that's where a lot of the, I wouldn't call it I don't know. Both teams look at other programs as rivals, but obviously there have been some very strong, physical, tough hitting games, but what it will be like 3 years from now, who knows? That's just college football in a nutshell. But, I expect NC State to be a tough physical defense against Clemson this year. The question is, will they be able to score enough? And that will be the question whenever State plays any good team. So that's kind of like how I've always looked at the NC State Clemson rivalry. And, it's had its ups and downs. And, like I said, there's some years where it's over in the first quarter, and some years there's a lot of drama in the fourth or overtime. So, but that's the litmus game, and as it should be.
Yeah. And like you said, it's forever changing. So a result from 2 years ago will not have any bearing on potentially 2024, 2025. But
players come and go.
Yeah.
Coaches stay, but players come and go.
So to wrap this up, I like to ask every writer what their perspective on the outside, because I can ask a Clemson, someone on the staff, or ask someone that's on campus regularly covering the team, what's your impression of Clemson from the last 2 years? But I think it's interesting to get somebody who's not constantly covering the team 24/7, has their eyes set on a different program, how they run things. So the last 2 seasons for Clemson, 6 losses in 2 years. They had 7 losses from 15 to 20, where they were national championships. I think 4 of those losses in that stretch came in the postseason. What has it been about Clemson the last 2 years where it feels like they've slipped and lost a step? And you see in the offseason, Dabo Swinney he fires Streeter, the first-year offensive coordinator, brings in Garrett Riley. There's a lot of attention and there's a lot of excitement that there hasn't been really felt in a while. What is it about Clemson, or what have you seen from Clemson the last 2 years, and where can they go to almost reestablish themselves as one of the big dogs, I put in quotes?
Obviously I know a lot of people focus on the quarterback position. And, when DJ Ungole came in for a few games because of Trevor Lawrence having a concussion, he was terrific. And it'll be fascinating to see how he does at Oregon State. But I've also pointed out I just don't think Clemson has had that dude at receiver. And, last year I thought they took a positive step where I liked that they had some tight ends who could catch the ball. And I thought the kid from Irmo, South Carolina, Antonio Williams, was able to come in and help in the slot. 2 years ago, that receiving core was like Bo Collins and a bunch of guys that you didn't know if they were going to make a play. It just didn't have the oomph, and I mentioned how Clemson became cool with Sammy Watkins. Well, you look at who they had at receiver, Watkins and DeAndre Hopkins and T. Higgins and Amari Rogers and even Cornell Powell at the end was a good college receiver. And I know I'm forgetting somebody else to go with T. Higgins, but Justin Ross before he got hurt. So I mean, they had guys. They had real playmakers and NFL studs, and then it fell off, and Ross got hurt, and they didn't 2 years ago. That they didn't have an Adam Renfro in the slot. They didn't have really anybody in the slot that would scare you. At least last year, Antonio Williams stepped up. I thought the tight ends were good, but to me, Clemson football is always about having that vertical threat. Who, as I mentioned earlier, you have to have somebody who can rip off a 60-yard touchdown. State didn't have that wide receiver last year. I don't know if they'll have that receiver this year. The game's harder when you don't have stud receivers. And you can talk about the running backs, and you can talk about offensive line and inconsistencies at quarterback, but you got to have studs at receiver. That's why Ohio State's been dominant, and why they keep getting incredible receivers year after year after year. Alabama has a great run of receivers. I think Georgia is starting to get receivers to come there, but that's the glamour position. And defensively, I think Clemson's been fine. I thought they recovered well after the secondary got picked on against Wake Forest earlier in the year. Made some changes. Linebackers have always been good. I kind of wondered if they could have gotten a little bit more out of Trenton Simpson last year, and then he ended up going in the third round, where most people thought he was a first round talent. But he's a kid that I've followed since the sophomore year at Mallard Creek. Defensive line has had some injuries, and that happens in college football. Tyler Davis has missed games. BZ missed games. Xavier Thomas, what didn't become that superstar that everybody was hoping. Maybe this year he does, but it was an adequate defensive line, but it wasn't quite the same as, say, Christian Wilkins, Dexter Lawrence, and two other defensive ends that all ended up getting drafted high. So, so you can see what it's been, and that's the beauty of Clemson, is that they know what the standard is at each position, because they've had great players at each position. But to me, that the offense has fallen off, and I thought the last 2 years, they just didn't have enough playmakers at receiver to go with maybe inconsistency at quarterback. And like I said, I thought DeJong played very well against State. I don't know where it went south. That's where not watching Clemson week in, week out, but in that particular game, he looked like the DeJong that we thought he was going to be. And then we'll see what happens with Kubnik and how that goes. But to me, it sounds like Clemson is back to getting some stud receivers and recruiting. Kid from Texas, kid from Tampa Catholic. So, if those guys end up being great players, I'm sure it'll make Cade's job easier at quarterback, or whoever the future quarterbacks are. And that's kind of how I've seen, Clemson. I think they've been fine, but it always goes back to that standard. As I mentioned earlier, State fans are happy if they win 8-9 games, beat UNC, make it to a bowl game. Clemson fans want to get to the title game. If you're going to get to the title game, you got to have some studs, and that's kind of how I've seen things as an outsider.
Yeah, and so it's kind of like you said with the NC State offense. We're just gonna have to wait and see for the fall for the results to really materialize. And with that, that'll conclude episode 131 of the Man with a Plan podcast, in part 5 of our Clemson football preview series covering NC State with Jacey Zembal. I want to thank you, Jacey, for joining the show. And guys, keep on subscribing. You guys have been killing it with this series. Just in general, it's been a great time to be able to cover the ACC and cover Clemson's football schedule. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Subscribe for more. Comment below your impressions of NC State for 2023. Thank you as always. Have a great day and take care.